Hello, hello. We're here in the room. I've got a nice drink. Two nice drinks, actually. Some milk. And coffee. All reared up, all ready to go. Today for discussion. A Feast of Snakes by Harry Crews. Now, Harry Crews was a writer from Georgia, very steeped in the Southern Gothic tradition. However, he took it up a notch, and his writings became much more grittier than some of the Southern Gothic that we know from Flannery O'Connor, Faulkner, even Cormac McCarthy. His writings became much more intense. That's what I've heard. This is the only novel from him that I've read. And he became very much associated with this movement. He was on the forefront of this movement called Grit Lit, a version of very intense Southern noir. Now, he came from a lower middle class, working class family, and that's very much what he wrote about. He went to university. He became a professor eventually at university. I don't think that he got his doctorate though, but he lived for most of his life a very working class life. Now, A Feast of Snakes. This was recommended on Goodreads to me. It was just one of those recommendations that appeared on the side. And I thought, looks interesting. I'll take a read. And I downloaded it. Well, wow, this is a crazy, crazy novel. It's quite short, though, under 200 pages. And it follows the story of Joe Lawn, who was a football star, high school football star. He was the boss snake, the boss star, the superstar high school football player. However, 2 years later, he's now living in a trailer. He's got a wife and 2 kids. They're sitting on high chairs. They're vomiting food, those little babies, and crying. He abuses his wife. He's quite cruel. He's an alcoholic, constantly drinking whiskey. He needs some whiskey. And he's working at his father's liquor store, and they're selling liquor, very often bootlegged, to the locals, mostly to the local blacks. And it's a dead end job. It seems like it's a dead end life for Joe Lawn. And he is not satisfied with how his life has turned out after he was praised. And everyone sort of worshipped him as the high school football star. So this is in Mystic, Georgia. This takes place in Mystic, Georgia. Very rural town. I think just a couple hundred people live there. And every year there is an event that happens there, the Roundup. And this is where people come from all over the country to catch snakes. It's a snake catching festival, essentially. It's a snake festival. And people come with all kinds of other snakes, anacondas, mambas, you name it. And all kinds of people show up and turn up to the event. Simply tourists, people from all over Georgia, all over the United States. Some academics even show up. Religious folk show up as well. There's a religious preacher that appears quite frequently in the narrative. But someone who's also coming to this event is Joe Lawn's high school sweetheart, Bernice. And him and Bernice had passionate, very physical love. But she comes from a pretty wealthy family. and she managed to go to university. Joe Lon couldn't go to university because he couldn't read. He pretty much coasted through school on being a high school jock, being the football star. That's what he got all his social status from. But Bernice went to university, and she's coming back for the summer. And this is creating a lot of apprehension for Joe Lon. He's going to see her. He's going to see his high school sweetheart and see how things have changed. Now, that is the defining point of the novel, her coming back and this roundup that happens. But a lot of crazy shit happens throughout the story. It kind of ambles and goes around to all kinds of really rancid, disgusting, disturbing events that happen throughout the narrative. I mean, you name it. Whatever disgusting is in this world is mentioned, at least sometimes very vividly in the narrative. There are passages about feces, for example. There are scenes with feces that are quite prominent. Everyone is dislikable, horrible, abusive in some ways. And if they're not abusive in one way, they're abusive in the other way. Like Joe Lon's father, who makes it known that you shouldn't be abusive towards your wife. However, his father, Joe Lon's father, who's known as Big Joe Lon Sr., he is training pit bulls, and he is so abusive in how he trains these pit bulls. He ties them up to essentially treadmills and has them just get banged up and all bloodied to get them prepared to fight. And this is also an event that is built up, this big pit bull match that is also going to happen during the Roundup Festival. Now, Joe Lon, Harry Crews creates the narrative in which everyone seems to revolve around Joe Lon. There seems to be almost a solar system in which Joe Lon is the sun, and everyone else is revolving around him. And he's comparing himself to these other characters, whether it be Willard, who is the current high school football star, who is threatening to break many of Joe Lon's records. Although they are essentially friends, they're also this friendship is very antagonistic towards each other. They are constantly trying to out-alpha each other. There's a comic scene in which there's essentially a bench press competition between the two. Harry Crews writes, there's a very subtle comedic aspect to some of the things Harry Crews writes about. It's very funny. I shouldn't say it's very funny, it's subtly funny sometimes, the way some of these situations show up, how absurd some of these characters are, and how they engage with others. For example, when Bernice comes back, she comes back to the roundup with a friend from university. And this male friend, she introduces him as a male friend, but he's really her new boyfriend. This male friend plays debate. He's on the debate team. He plays debate. And Joe Lon doesn't know what that is. Debate? He had never heard of that. Debate. What is debate? And he says something to the effect of, must be some kind of fag European sport like soccer. As far as Joe Lon was concerned, anyone who played soccer was a fag. So it's like these absurd, hyper-masculine, I don't want to say completely Southern, because that almost makes the Southern into a comedic, grotesque caricature. And that is what many of these Southern Gothic writers do, but I don't think that they're trying to necessarily make fun of the South too much. Perhaps to paint a picture of some of the social issues that are plaguing southern United States, whether it be racism, hypermasculinity, alcohol abuse. Harry Crews isn't afraid to take it this to notch 11 in showing how disturbing, whether it be racist, people can be, and there is racism in this narrative. There's a clear sense that the whites are quite racist to the blacks. So there is some irony and comedy in this, but it's very subtle. But on the surface of everything is pretty much horror. It's just a lot of murder and killing, talk about killing and abuse. Scalping people is mentioned. That people are getting this sense of bloodlust during the roundup. As I mentioned, also shit is something that is talked about quite a lot. Harry Crews is very physical. He likes to accent that humans are quite physical, and we're physical beings, and we shit and we have excrement. And the last year during the roundup, there weren't enough resources there to clean up the shit from the people in the roundup, and there's a long passage detailing this. And that's why it's very important now that they have the porta potties to deal with all these people. But there'll be there's passages like that. And it's gross, but oddly a bit funny. I'm sorry, but it's a bit funny to think about like someone having to clean up all of that. It's gross, but kind of comic in a very, very lowbrow way. Joe Lon is very abusive to his wife Elfie, incredibly abusive. However, she stays with him, and she does try to subtly assert herself. She is aware that he's abusive and that this behavior isn't all right. However, she still seems to stay with him and love him. And there is a sense of endurance in that she's a character that demonstrates a lot of endurance. Joe Lon's sister, Beater, is a character that perhaps also demonstrates endurance. However, she has gone crazy. After 10th grade, it seems like she lost her mind. She seemed to be a pretty normal student, but now she's cooped up in her room, and she just watches TV all day. Doesn't leave her room. It's rancid. It stinks there. She doesn't even leave the room to go to the bathroom. But she sort of numbs herself through the static of the TV. And it's alluded to that something may have happened to her, or she may have seen something. Well, she did see something. Joe Lon's mother took her own life. And it seems like that may have been an event that scarred Beater. However, as I mentioned, everything seems to revolve around Joe Lon, and he starts to compare himself to different people in the narrative, and you see how they relate to him. So whether it be Willard, the new boss snake, who is also a new football star, who might beat some of his records and surpass Joe Lon, or even the sheriff who went to Vietnam, has a pegged leg, who's only a few years older than Joe Lon, quite young, like probably would be 25, 24, who's an abusive sheriff who kidnaps women essentially and sexually assaults them. But there's always a sense of his relationship to him. Oh, now this person is doing this. Now he's a sheriff. And he's coming to realize that there are some people at his age now that are at university that are starting to forge paths into careers that are quite prosperous and could get out of here, such as Bernice's new boyfriend, or the character of Duffy Dieter, who's a bit of a drifter, who shows up in this narrative, who is in some ways a bit of an antithesis to Joe Lon, because while he's not this bulky, large football jock, he's still very strong. He takes part in that bench pressing competition, and I think he bench presses quite an impressive weight, like 350 or something like that pounds, even though he weighs only 160 pounds, which, if you know weightlifting, is incredibly impressive to be able to bench press more than double your body weight. But he's a bit of a drifter, and he's got his girlfriend Suzanne Gender, who is also very sultry, very sexually described woman. A lot of the women are described quite very sexually. It's quite clear this is very prurient. It's it's a very sultry novel where a lot of sex is described. But Suzanne Gender, while she is quite sexy, and she can be compared also to the high school cheerleaders who also are in this narrative, such as Bernice and Bernice's sister, Hard Candy, who happens to be dating Willard. So you see there's a mirror there, Willard and Hard Candy, Bernice and Jolan. But Suzanne Gender, while she is quite sexy, she's also a student in the university, I believe a philosophy student. And Duffy Dieter is a lawyer or in law school. So these are educated people who are also quite capable and physical and much more charismatic than Jolan and Willard, these just high school jocks who've devoted their whole lives to football, essentially, and drinking and promiscuity. So there is a tension there that Jolan has wasted his potential and his life. The narrative does build up and there's a sense of an apocalypse is approaching with this roundup, and for many people it may as well be that case. For Jolan, he's coming to terms that his life, the life that he had been defined by, being this football star, might be coming to an end. And that is essentially the narrative. It does peer into a existential lens. To start the novel starts with there's a quote before the novel by Richard Eberhard. He was an American poet, and the quote is, "If I could only live at a pitch that is near madness, when everything is as it was in my childhood, violent, vivid, and of infinite possibility, that the sun and moon broke over my head." A sense of insanity growing. Perhaps an insanity of childhood, a very physical insanity, intangible insanity. That is something that perhaps is expressed in the novel. When there's a scene, as I mentioned, with a preacher, a snake preacher, and he, incredibly, obviously religious, but a very twisted type of religion, very in some ways non-denominational, and his name is Victor, and he is kind of preaching. Jolan and Willard approach him essentially to try and kind of mock him and make fun of him. They're just bullies, really. Jolan and Willard, especially Willard, they're quite mean. They're mean kids. And it gleamed, this is the quote, "It gleamed in the sun, and Victor traced its outline with one bony finger." They're describing this mosaic that this lady is making. "It came to Jolan that she pinned rattles to a canvas relentlessly and with great joy, and Victor followed God the same way. What did he, Jolan, do? What did he have? He had once had football to fill up his mind and his body and his days, and so he had never thought about it. Then one day, football was gone, and it took everything with it. He kept thinking something else would surely take its place, but nothing ever did. He stumbled from one thing to the next thing, from wife to babies to making a place for crazy campers bent on catching snakes. But nothing gave him anything back. So here he was, lying under a dead weight, doing what he'd done 5 years ago, when he was a boy. If it had meant anything then, he had forgotten that. He had forgotten what? And merciful God, it meant nothing now. His life had become a not very interesting movie that seemed condemned to see over and over again. So there is a sense of existentialism and meaning. The way Harry Crews writes is a bit erratic. I do like his prose. It's quite to the point, very vivid. Not too descriptive, but descriptive enough. As far as his storytelling, the story does kind of amble a bit, and he starts to insert all kinds of characters into this narrative. There are quite a lot of characters in this story, and they just kind of get inserted for a new scene. There's a scene that happens in a bar, and then a new character comes in, and then that character kind of appears at the end. All these characters, he kind of builds this assembly of characters, and they all come to roost at the end. But that is Harry Crews's A Feast of Snakes. It's very horrific. There's a subtle humor in it, but quite a gruesome novel, but a writer who I envision reading more of. So if you're looking for a Southern Gothic that's quite intense, I do highly recommend A Feast of Snakes from Harry Crews. Take care. See ya.